Thank you. I want to begin by introducing the people on the stage. So today's session is top-down about design and mentoring, and I think that those are things that you can't find out about on our website, and this is not me presenting our portfolio today at all, so leave if you wanted that. We were going to have Julie Bargman as the moderator, but Julie's got her back out of alignment, and in a way it was really fortuitous because Julie grew up for a brief period of time and was mentored, I hate that word, at MVVA, and so when you think of these things, I thought, it'd be really cool to have somebody who actually knew what it was like to be bitched at by me, the way that it goes in the office. So it's actually better that Shannon is the moderator. I think you all know who she is. She's one of Catherine Gustafson's partners, GGN from Seattle. All that I want to say about her is that along with Claude Cormier and Raymond Jungels, I think the three of them are among the contemporary geniuses. I never see anything. I don't know that I like to hear all the words that come out of their mouths, but you probably will not like to hear all the words that come out of my mouth today either, although there will be little or no profanity. Anytime I see something that one of those three people did, my antenna go up and I'm interested because I see originality and things. I don't see a reflection of MVVA, but I see work that's very powerful. So these are three of the younger staff at MVVA. Immediately next to where I was sitting a minute ago is Scott Strebe. Oh, by the way, all five of us are state school grads. Yay, state school. And I don't think any of us grew up with silver spoons in our mouths either. So that is another quality that we share up here. Scott Strebe is a graduate of Colorado State University and has been in the firm for 9 years, and it's a funny thing to say about somebody, but he survived the attack at Columbine High School, and when I was interviewing him, I think one of the reasons that I took him was the insights about that experience in his life, which is not what he's going to talk about today, but it definitely colored who he is. Also, his mom is Mrs. Strebles on South Park, if you know that. So, really. And so we call him Strebles sometimes. Next to him is Chris Donahue, which with great relief, I just found out today after Chris has worked for me for 8 years, that he also, like the four of us, are all middle children in our family. So today's lecture is just about finding commonalities. Chris left us for a couple of years, went to the GSD, and then has come back recently. And Andy, by the way, none of these people were ever my student. I think everybody thinks, Michael, he teaches at Harvard, he just scrapes up all the good people, and there are 54 different design school degrees in the 70 or so people who have design degrees at MVVA. So yeah, there are a few more Harvard degrees than others, and Andy has one of those degrees. But so that's who we are, and so I want to talk about where design comes from. I'm just curious, does anybody think they know? Oh, good, because that was the answer that I was hoping for. I think that if you think that you know where design comes from, you probably are not a designer. And I think if you think design doesn't come from somewhere, you're probably also not a designer. So there you go. I live a designer's life. I was talking about my grandson the other day, who's a stunningly excellent basketball player. And somebody said to me, well, why is he such a good basketball player? And I said, oh, because he has played basketball since he was 4 years old, and that's all he thinks about all day, and it's what he does on every vacation, and he probably never has a day when he doesn't hold the basketball in his hand. That's me as a designer. That is part of how you become a designer. It has to be something that wraps itself around you, that you're endlessly involved with. This is Caroline and me last Sunday taking a look at the Monk's Garden in Boston, just like, hey, how is this working? Nobody, when I'm there, knows that I created it, and I learned something from it. I also learned that the stewardias are poking you in the eye, and they need to be trimmed, and that certain plants died, but I also see people doing things and informing me about the success of what I've done. So we, and Scott, when we're about 10 minutes before I should stop, just come over and say, hurry up, Michael, please. But I'm going to try not to have too many digs, but I'm going to have a couple right now. I don't believe in manifestos, LAF. I think we have to be careful about thinking that there is a collective umbrella. I think that our genius as a profession has always been our diversity and our individuality and our originality. And I also wish that these gatherings were less about continuing ed points. I think it's become a tyranny. I think that there are conversations that you don't necessarily need to get points for. And I just think that we've reached the point where we all spend maybe too much time worrying about that. I said recently to one of my principals, I thought when you turn 65, which I did this year, that you should no longer have to have continuing ed points. And he said, no, Michael, that's actually when they should start to make sure that you're relevant. So the other thing that we say, and you know when I say these questions, we don't stand around and say, hey, Chris, who are we designing this landscape for? And why is this being made? This is sort of like saying when you're hanging out with your best friend, gee, how am I being your best friend today? You know, it's like something that's deeply within you. But it's very important for who we are. I also think that, at least for us, clients are extremely important. When we won the City Arch River contest in St. Louis, he actually didn't want us to win. He thought I was an a-hole. He didn't take a shining to me. We turned that around. This is a man who single-handedly, I would say, has oversaw the collection of over $300 million in public and private revenue. Clients are amazing people. And they oversee our work, and they are the intermediary of the design conversation of us delivering the change of something which in the end is neither for us or for him or her as the client. And so it brings us back to this very deep conversation that has to come down about what it means to make the places that we inhabit in the world. And my last dig, I don't really think that as a profession we know that much about saving the world. I think we're getting a little bit too off into that. The pendulum in this field, it's always got to swing someplace crazy. And, there are people that probably know how to save the world and we should be a part of it, but we as a profession really need to know what we're good at. And I think it's pretty important. So for me, making things and designing things is an interchangeable enterprise, and I want to say the knowledge of how those work together is maybe relatable through me explaining how I discovered landscape architecture. So, like many 16-year-old boys or girls who grew up in a rural, very rural community, my high school class had 40 people in it, I was getting to that point where I was thinking about going to college, and my parents had sold the family farm and built the little house on the corner. Like maybe many of you who grew up in farms know the sad tale of family farming and how agribusiness drove people like my parents to have other jobs. But my mom, I was the green thumb. I'm one of 5. I was the green thumb kid in the family, and I was visual and redheaded and left-handed. And very different from my 2 older brothers. So my mom wanted 2 trees in front of the house, and she's like, she's probably making me go because she was afraid I would smoke pot or do something while she was away, I don't know. But I'm kidding a little, although I did smoke pot when I was 16. Which was a bigger deal in the 60s than it is today, by the way. But we went to a tree farm, and I remember the electricity. I felt like there was electricity in me when I saw these rows of baby trees waiting to go and do something else. It was we grew crops, and I understood the idea of production, but it kind of had never occurred to me that, like my grandparents' house with this beautiful row of sugar maples for sap collection may have been trees that came from a tree farm. And then 6 months later, my best buddy and I were, very unusually for my background, on the great tour of Europe our last year in high school with his mom, who was a Czech citizen. And the first night we were in Europe, like good 17-year-old boys, we snuck out of our room after we heard Sidonia's door close and went exploring the town, and I wandered into the Tuileries, and a silence fell over me. So 6 months after that, I still had never seen the word landscape and architecture put together. I was in a class that I was forced to take. It was assigned to me. I was going to be a history teacher. I was in an ecology class. The guy was retiring, and he said one day, here's a book by Ian McHarg, which, by the way, had very little, I love Ian. It had very little influence on where I went. I love Ian. I'll never do that again because that's sort of like Donald Trump. I love Ian. I really love Hillary. But landscape architecture, and I have goosebumps on my back telling you this. My antenna went up, and my boat changed direction. And I knew I was a landscape architect before I was one. And I'm telling you that because I'm a very deep believer in the way that our interior selves have intelligence and knowledge and information, and I think it's an incredible part of how design works. So designing, if you can't tell, that's Andy 2 days ago. We're working on the last pier of Brooklyn Bridge Park, and it's the kind of, and this is also a design of Andy's and mine on the right that we're working on now. But this is the other dimension of designing for us, which is, I guess I want to say that when all of us stop talking and when the client goes away and the graphics are gone and somebody walks into a landscape that we've made, it only has its own very real physical and felt qualities to affect that person's life. And so this is a project Scott's going to talk about. It's Javits Plaza. And first of all, in the blue, we're trying to figure out the scale. Scale and material is what I'm trying to say is what delivers. Like they are our visual words in a landscape. And they're the thing that make us believe it or not. So anyway, looking at materials and thinking about how it's like writing or putting something together. And for me, this is my grandson, Jack, and it looks bad in this picture, like I'm actually making his entry in the fair for him. These are his chocolate chip cookies. But he's actually instructing me on how he wanted the chocolate chips arranged on the top there. And you can see who's overseeing it getting done. But what am I talking about here? I think that there's, how do we advance knowledge as designers when we're making a project? And for me, things that give me tactile and experiential information are knowledge for me. They help connect me to that thing I described a minute ago, which is how a project is felt and understood and meaningful to the people that we make it for. I had to put this quote in today. I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I kind of hardly ever listen to classical music, and I never read. I'm a TV junkie, actually. But I mine literature, and a friend of mine, a filmmaker, we were talking about creativity in this seminar I gave at Harvard in landscape a few years ago, talking about how we create. And Horowitz is talking about kind of the three realms of performing in a piano. And in a sense that I don't think that it's such a stretch. It used to annoy me so much that people like Halperin were trying to make correlations between what it means to be a designer and what it means to be a landscape architect. And my problem was I was looking for a take-home. I was young and I was looking for a take-home message. And the point of these explorations, and I hope the sense of what I'm doing today, is to just give you not so much a roadmap as an understanding. I just have to read, without brains, you're a fiasco. Without means, you're an amateur. Without heart, you're a machine. I mean, if you can't insert the word landscape in every one of those and think that the three of those don't contribute to who we are, I don't think we're on the same page. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the importance of the unpredictable and the predetermined. And I simply want to say, one of my young staff, I knew I was going to hire this guy in a second. I loved this kid when he walked in my office. So he didn't know it, but I was like playing with him a little bit, and I'm like, well, what do you want to ask me? He was already hired, and he said, well, tell me about the obstacles. Like, first of all, what 25-year-old who's never worked in an office set, tell me about obstacles in your life, Michael. And I thought it was an amazing question because I love saying to him that, I don't really have obstacles. And by the way, I wasn't a linebacker. I don't mean that I run things down, but what I mean with the predetermined in the work that we do is that the way we encounter the things we can't change as designers is the place where we draw strength and knowledge. I kind of hate the word opportunity. It's like a limitation is an opportunity. They're quite often quite short of being opportunities, but they are things that you navigate. And then the unpredictable are, of course, all the things that we also find difficult when we're younger in the career, that there are all these things that we can't manage. And it's like this is like this in Brooklyn Bridge Park because there's a subway underneath this, and we actually were not allowed to put soil on top of it for reasons of weight, and we didn't have a big budget in Brooklyn Bridge Park, and we couldn't use foam to build up the soil because we couldn't afford it. And so we had heard in a public meeting that people wanted us to create a way that you can get your feet into the East River. So you conflate those variables together, and that's how that happened. And similarly, the Picnic Peninsula, which is, if you haven't been there, please, when you go to New York, see it. It's the coolest place where basically there's just a whole bunch of grills where no matter who you are in New York City, you can come and have a barbecue and sit on the edge of New York Harbor. And we did that there because that's a relieving platform with water under it. And it would have been too expensive to take it out. And it was Matt's genius, I think, who said, wait a second, it could become like a floating island. How are we doing on time? Not so good?
You have like 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, good. I'm almost finished. Not really. Okay, so this is for the lofty people in the room. I would have been picking on Anita Beresbaitia, my chairman, if she was here. I'm sure she'll hear about this, but I don't really trust ideas, especially good ones. Robert Rauschenberg, the painter, said, I'd rather put my trust in materials that confront me because they put me in touch with the unknown. And when Robert Rauschenberg talks about the unknown, I hear him talking about the breadth of experiences that he wishes successive generations of people to have in response to his painting, and he knows that he doesn't know exactly how they're going to respond, but he's framing a kind of limit and reference of those. And I think that's another thing that we do in our choices of materials and project. This is the ramp, and this would only look this way. This only looks this way because these erosion-controlled tiles, which are used in rural landscapes, descend into the harbor and can absorb the impact of sea level rise and daily tidal flux, and the tectonics of that playing against this riprap stone creates this, for me, this tension that's a very beautiful and yet a very practical thing. And similarly, in terms of the predictable and the unpredictable, the predetermined, that is, there are oftentimes many things in projects that become a kind of register, a kind of thing that doesn't change. And architects would be rolling their eyes like they do so well, and being upset if I said that I saw their architecture in my projects as a datum. But I do think of that dialectic between building and landscape, and I see landscape as this changing thing, this thing that brings life to the presence of architecture. So how many, can we show hands? How many know who Leo Leone is? Oh no. Well, I'm so glad that you've come today, because if you get nothing out of this, you will have some great books to give to nieces or read to kids or grandkids. So Leo Leone, fantastic graphic designer, communist, like Hillary, wrote this book, which I love, and I think it's kind of, we're getting now towards MVVA and away from Michael, so, and there's a big distinction. But the point of Swimmy is that big fish were eating little fish, and Swimmy had the idea that all the fish could swim together and scare away the big fish. And I don't know that we're trying to scare anybody away at MVVA, but we are like, if you've ever seen the beauty of like a swarm of small fish, they move along, but they're like animated, and they're like this, and it's just the most amazing idea of socially what we're about as a collection of people. But I'm always looking for Frederick, which is Leo Leone's other famous story, which is about this, probably this mouse who would have been called the loser in the mouse pack, because while his little other mice were dutifully picking up corn and oats, Frederick was writing poems and making paintings. And then one winter, they ran out of food, and probably not because Frederick didn't do his job, but probably because of global warming, and winter was a month longer than it should have been. Frederick read his poems and showed his paintings to his colleagues. So I'm always looking for Frederick. I don't know that it's fair to say that that's a collection of Fredericks, but collectively, with Laura in the pack, maybe you're the eye of the fish, Laura, we try to operate like swimming. So I'm going to talk about my influences now. Sylvia Crow, my first intern, I was 20. I knew nothing. Allegedly, I was charming. You know, they were so kind to me, but the amazing thing about working for her, and it's another person who's just kind of settled into, we don't know our recent history and as a profession, and I think it's one of our huge mistakes because there's so much to learn about what just preceded you, and I don't think I ever would have said that before I was 50. It was the passion and the belief in the power of landscape that was Sylvia's gift to me. That, and she didn't send me home. Her office was in London because I really had nothing to offer. Then again, they were paying me the equivalent of $15 a week, so there you go. In 1973, I had a Dumbarton Oaks Fellowship, and I wrote it to study Dan Kiley. And I drove in my VW Bug with no air conditioning to every existing Dan Kiley project in America, 21 years old, you know, all scrubbed up and clean. Actually, I was pretty much a dirty hippie at the time. But I slipped in Halprin, and I found the contrast of the calm and the gentleness of Dan's landscape, something quite different to the love of artifice, and also something that made me very squeamish for about 20 years, this interest in abstracting nature, which obviously doesn't make me squeamish anymore. So that was a very interesting thing, but, oh, you've got him in the wrong place. We'll jump back. What I discovered on the way home was the project and the man who became my hero in the field. I went to Gaswork Park. I was completely freaked out about it. I didn't understand its beauty. It was so powerful and yet so friendly, so like a huge dog that didn't have a mean thing about it. And it took me a very long time to understand Rich's work and him. But I would say that if you were able to create a series of layers of Kiley, Halprin, and Haig, and forgive me for pompously suggesting that they add up to what we do, but there is, I feel that what we do in the office is me, at the very least, looking through those three bodies of work and finding a common element they all have is an incredible love of the people they're made for. Lori, are you here? Okay. That's probably just as well. I had the great fortune in 1982 to start teaching at Harvard when Laurie Olin had become the chairman. And this is a different kind of mentor. This is I think, one of our great living teachers. And I love Laurie's work, and I love him as a person. He's extraordinary. But there was an incredible generosity on Laurie's part of looking beyond the surface qualities of my work and helping me project into the future of where my work might go. And he said to me one day, because everything in the 80s for me was linear, everything. In fact, I had a client that called me Larry Linear. Laurie said, you know, when you get over this geometry and linear thing and discover irregularity, your work is going to be a lot better. Harsh words, but true. Anyway. In 1982, I also stopped working for Kevin Lynch, and he said to me, you know, Michael, I observed that the landscape architects who were most successful are people who made a lot of gardens when they were young. I was already making a lot of gardens, so that was pumping me up. It's like, oh, all right, I'm already doing that. But I took to heart what Kevin was saying, and what he was saying was that the medium as landscape is actually, for designers, extremely difficult. It's, you know, it doesn't have many of the metrical qualities that we make architecture out of. It's living, it's big, it's small, it's impacted by the forces of nature. And so my segue to what these guys are going to do, how are we doing on time? 10 minutes? 10 minutes, perfect. The segue is to talk, I'm going to go back to the 80s, when I was only a little bit old. Well, Andy's a baby, but the other two are only a couple of years younger than who I was. Well, in 1982, I was 31, so that's like how old you guys are, right? So I thought, and most of you probably don't know what we did in the 80s unless you're from Minneapolis, and then it's all being torn down now anyway. So, but I'm going to talk about very early projects because one of the themes of my approach to design, and one of the things that I'm trying to show today, is how ways of thinking and ways of looking accrue and kind of become a palimpsest among us in the office. And I guess I want to say that I hope that the impression that you get after these guys talk is that I try to run the office as somebody that that our relationship is one of learning with rather than learning from. That we have, when we sit down to a table, we're in some way equals. So I had these amazing first clients. I don't know, it's like, how lucky am I that when I was 34 years old, Mickey, not Martin, but Mickey called me up, and you know, in those days when the phone rang, you answered it. There was no caller ID. There was no answering machine. It might be your mom. And let me tell you, if I was home and I didn't answer the phone and my mom found out about it, I'd be one sorry SOB. Or it might be the school nurse saying my daughter was sick or blah, blah, blah. So you answered the phone, and Mickey said, I'll make it short, we're going to have a competition. We have 5 candidates. Half of us want you to win. Half of us want Barbara Solomon to win. Can we not have the competition, and can you and Barbara collaborate? And so I tell that story because, first of all, most competitions are kind of messed up that way, as it turns out. But also, we've been collaborators from the beginning of who we are. And if you don't know Bobby's work, please try to find out about it. Very beautiful, very inspiring work. But not a person who's, I mean, if you think my feet aren't on the ground, she's like a helium balloon, like floating up at the ceiling in terms of her aloftness. And so we were quite the pair. We also had to design and build this project in an extremely short period of time. These are the entry gardens. So Mickey and Martin then said to us, we want a series of absorbing landscapes that create a kind of ceremonial arrival. Minneapolis is really quite cold in the winter, and so this connects the distant parking lots with the museum, or it used to, changing things around there. And that's what these gardens were for. So they're very, very unusual assignment. I just want to say that even though our models don't try to look so professional anymore, this was the beginning of how important models are. Why? Because you can either get yourself down or you can lift them up, and you can put your body inside of it experientially. And I don't care which designer says so. That's the hardest thing to do as a designer, is to imagine space. It's easier to imagine materiality, especially because you can pick up pieces of it and put it on the ground, but getting space, and space is like, think of ancestrally who we were before words, and how important in our evolutionary history the perception of space, even think of it today. I mean, I remember when my granddaughter was at her communion, and it was in a big church, and she hadn't been in one, and she spent the whole time like this, like just feeling the vault of the church. It's part of how we're wired to be. It's one of the most important things in how our firm has I used to have a mustache. I also used to weigh 175 pounds, so there you go. But I learned from Mickey and Martin the importance of mock-ups. And why are mock-ups important? I mean, some people are reticent about mock-ups because they're like, it shows an insecurity or an inability to know your medium. You know, we only have so much that we can do in our imaginations, and things that are tangible are so much more powerful than things that are inside. So that the mock-up is a little bit like that moment when there's an apple pie baking in the oven, or popcorn, you know, the sound and the smell, but you haven't eaten it yet. It's like suddenly all of these receptors in your body are giving you information that isn't possible in the same way in your imagination. So yeah, mock-ups are about metrics and scale, but they're also a thing that connect you back to the work and give you a new way of understanding, and also, I would say, caring about it in a more deeply and informed way. Our tradition of technical innovation was going on back then. Would have been better if Laura was there, but was Tim there? Laura's husband, Tim, who, by the way, told me to hire Laura and said, and when you hire her, you won't need me, which has turned out not to be quite true, but I think as much his admiration. But we love technical innovation at MVVA. It's cool stuff. And I'm a plant guy. That's what I used to teach at Harvard. And that in the first project, I used palm trees that were collected in the desert and that we were moving to Minnesota. And I was told that we should change their acclimation to light levels. And so we stripped them and we moved them and we let them leaf out in a lower light level before we moved them to Minneapolis. Unfortunately, that worked so well that in 15 years they grew right through the glass roof of the greenhouse and they had to be replaced. So we used something other than Washingtonia the next time around. There they are when they were installed. Just one other quick project. So this was cool. How many minutes now? 5. Really 5?
Sure. Yeah.
Really 5?
Yeah, 5.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I'm not 5 minutes over?
5's good.
Okay. Could you count the minutes down while
Sure,
I'm
yeah.
doing it? Okay. So this was an artist who sold a piece to General Mills, and he said, you know, Michael, they took me out there and they wanted me to cite the piece, but I got to tell you, I think their landscape's terrible. So I talked them into letting me hire you to redesign the front. So I want you to make a place. I mean, I know, like, who says stuff like that? But he really did, and they really did hire us for that. And we changed a turf lawn with symmetrical Norway maples, one on each side, and symmetrical flagpoles into a short grass prairie. End run of that is that didn't last very long, but it was there for a while until the CEO who liked it left. The next guy thought it made the front of the headquarters look like a trailer park, and he had it ripped out his first week. But that's us putting Mel's piece. This begins a long other collaboration with us of working with artists. And it also began because Matt Urbanski had joined the firm then, and with his love of science and design, this idea that we would actually burn the front of the corporate headquarters once a year. Guess we really didn't understand corporate America all so well. A lot of people didn't think it was funny, like I suspect some of you do. It was also great because it drove all the mice out, and the harrier hawks were like right there, like waiting, like, but TMI perhaps. So I'm going to end by talking about a recent project that some of you know. The client, Ann Hawley, her last project as it turned out, and us working on a site outside of this. I mean, this is insane. This is what the inside of this turn of 19th century, 1900 building has, this space which is all about vertical lift and all about monumental space and all about impressing you, honestly. And so that's our site outside, very small, 18-foot high brick wall around it. And I made the opposite of that. I made something that was intensely personal. I find museums overwhelming. I look at 3 or 4 great paintings and, like, you know, when fuses start to blow, like, zzz, you know, it's like, I'm just like, I can't look at something else, I want out of here. And I also have the attention span of a gnat, so I have very short tolerance to museums. I wanted to make something that had a strong interiority. I wanted to make something that was exceptionally about self, and so we made this garden, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the stages. So this is the first sketch, and I just want to say something about first sketches. They are less, for me, about the beginning of generating form, although there are formal similarities between this sketch and how it ended up. It's not very much like what it ended up, but it's all curves, for those of you that curves give angina to. And it doesn't have a middle, and it doesn't have proper beginnings and ends. And so this was me making it as much as it could be something that you step into and are absorbed by. But I also want to say that for me, the moment where Anne has told me what she wants, the director, and I've walked around the museum and I saw that interior space and I'm like, how can I do anything good when that crazy good space is over there? The minute you start to draw something, it all, for me, starts to become quieter, and I'm less of a tornado inside, and there's the scratch of the pencil on the paper, and just the fact that there's something tangible that I can look at and not stuff swirling around in my imagination is the beginning of making a transformation from the imaginary to the real. We love playful models. If you compare this to the Walker model, where we were definitely trying to impress, we were really trying to impress with everything we did in our first project, and I was constantly having Mickey and Martin say, I don't like that, let's go to lunch and we'll tell you what we want you to do. So models are now very much a part of a dialogue between imaginary and the physical. And then those get converted to drawings. This is Matt Gerard, who was the project manager. Could have been one of these guys up here. And then on site, we try to use, we actually limit our practice, we don't do any international work unless you consider Canada another country. Sorry, Andy, Candy's Canadian. They call America south of the border, by the way. We do a lot of work in Toronto, and we feel very fortunate to do that. And it's only an hour away. But we go to sites and mock things up. We also involve ourselves exceptionally with the patterning of material. And that's immediately after install. In fact, the installer is obviously like, what the hell? You see him looking up there. And then we do as much fine scale adjusting. Again, because if you think of what I said about when the project is done and you're not there to interpret it, you have to make sure that it delivers absolutely every bit of experiential potential as it can. We use the single trunk wintergreen arborvitae to break up the tyranny of that perimeter wall, especially in winter, and that's me playing arborvitae. I'm not talking a lot about plants today, but they are the whole matrix that hold this project together, and it's really, I suppose in the end, I'm coming back to the beginning and saying that it's about the landscape in the end is something that actually becomes predetermined on our part, and the way that people use it becomes unpredictable. So how does that work in MVVA today is the segue to these guys. My sketch on the left, I don't draw very well, but that's my attempt to get at what A.E. Bai would have called the calligraphy of every tree, the kind of identity that it has in terms of its structure, and how those calligraphies together and what those plants are, which is a complete celebration of things in the spring for a project at Wellesley College. And one of our much younger interns, Paloma, working with me on her first project and her attempts to take, how would you like to get that sketch and try to make sense out of it? I wouldn't. And then others in the firm share in the mentoring, like Emily Mueller-DeSellis, one of our principals. And so it's my segue to introducing our visitors and saying that each three of these MVVA staff people, in the very early parts of their career, I think it's fair to say that not everybody, it's not fair to say, it's correct to say that junior people are not always tracked, nor do they want to be tracked as designers in the firm. And with the kind of technical experts that we have in the firm, many people who come in are very happy to get busy with wanting to know how to be great builders and overseeing construction. So the first person who's going to talk is Scott Street.
Thank you, Michael. So on the screen right now is the Brooklyn Oasis project that was completed in 2010 that Michael and I worked very closely on together. But concurrently, we were also working on Javits Plaza from 2009 to 2013. And I chose this project to present because it was really a coming-of-age project for me in the office, and just learned a ton. So the site is located in South Manhattan, in front of probably the most important federal building in all of New York City. You can see it on the lower right-hand side. And the client was the GSA. It was a Obama stimulus package project in 2009. That was a big deal for us. And for that reason, we had 5 months to complete the project from the first sketch to documentation. The whole office worked on it at one point. We also had a series of peer reviewers of landscape architects and architects, and we met with them 3 times. So it was collaborative in the sense that they were able to tell us whatever they thought, and we had to respond. It was maddening at times and great at others.
Mostly maddening.
Mostly maddening. And the plaza has a huge history. It's been rebuilt once every decade, and it was also home to Richard Serra's work of art, The Tilted Arc. And this quote really struck me, saying, "Art is not democratic, it's not for the people." And at this point, I was 2 years into my career at MVVA. I came from Colorado State, and I just thought I was going to come make art for Michael and just draw pretty stuff, and that's what design was. But this project really helped me understand the difference, the social and environmental paradigm and agenda, and it was just great. So we started off by asking what landscape experience was missing from Lower Manhattan. Did they need a park, a garden, a plaza? And we kind of came to this conclusion that a hybrid between garden and plaza was the most appropriate, where you have the civic qualities of a plaza and kind of the intimacy of the garden all in one. And because of that, we started to generate these biomorphic shapes, and Michael came to the office one day and suggested that we study the work of Moreau and that our work would benefit from kind of just analyzing his paintings. So here's a painting of his, and the positive and negative qualities of it really struck me. And we began to just really deeply try to understand that work, and I think the sketches just opened up a whole new door creatively, and I hope you can see the difference between those two sketches there. It also really enabled us to study this and explore it, and over probably 3 or 4 weeks, we were sketching every hour, trying to improve it, address issues from the client, and really tie it into what they asked us to pursue as a design. Also during that process, Michael sometimes makes sketches for us to loosen us up a little bit. This will be an unnamed client-side individual that we had fun with. So we got to this final design, and the rest of the presentation I'll just share with you why the clients thought it was the appropriate move and why we thought it was the appropriate move. We presented this final design model to the GSA and the commissioner, but one of the important moves was to hold the corner of Worth and Lafayette and create an urban room. Since the plaza's on structure, you're about 4 feet higher than street level, so we wanted to hold landscape at that corner and pop people above to kind of remove them from the fray of New York City. And then along Lafayette, we spilled landscape down to kind of create a vortex and invite you up into the plaza. The GSA was very interested in us doing something historic and traditional on the site. So this notion of a center and this ellipse was a nod towards kind of the historic landscapes you would see in front of a building like this. And then we proceeded to carve in these internal garden spaces and then provide an urban scale of circulation. The building's 1 million square feet, so you could imagine the number of people coming in and out every day. Also, Michael was working on this Dutchess County residence at the time, where he was pursuing marble patterning, and oftentimes our work on gardens inoculates an idea and allows us to kind of pursue it further in other projects. So there's these overarching themes that inform one another, and just the technical understanding of the material was huge in what we did at Javits. Another challenging but turned out to be kind of great crit from the peer reviewers was to integrate the facade of the building into the plaza. We definitely rolled our eyes at the time, but embraced it as an idea. We mocked up the paving of the window dimension in our office, tried to get a feel for it. This is referring to the slide earlier that Michael presented. And we just went for it. And I think you can see it here, the mirrored facade into the paving. We also worked with Carpenter Norris on the project to address wind and sun issues. With the landforming, we were able to create wind shadows that kind of held you in a microcosm of comfort and located the seating areas in the sunniest spots of the plaza. I won't get into it too much, but there was a huge technical complexity to the project and the layering of the existing structure that you can see here. And I think we successfully answered the question of what is the missing experience of this part of Manhattan. The spring flowers of the magnolia, water hitting stone and the kind of calm that creates, and just this kind of emotive quality of the material. And when we were on site building the project, Michael had this instinct to weave in the veining of the marble into the cobbles, and while it didn't seem like that powerful of an idea in the design phase, going out there and seeing the materials come together and having that instinct is a really powerful moment where kind of brains, heart, and means all comes together.
It wasn't in the documents.
It was not in the documents, no. and the paving contractor was exquisite on the job. Took them like 3 times longer than they were supposed to spend. And now, Andy, you'll come to the podium. Welcome. So again, to kind of bring back the theme of how we've all kind of started working on a smaller garden space as a means to kind of figure out ourselves as a designer, and also how we kind of work closely with Michael, and that weaves its way into our other work. This is something I worked closely on, Michael. It's the woodland garden at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Just a small kind of marginalized space on the site where we've worked to kind of create this small enclosed garden kind of tucked away. And it's still not constructed, so we'll see. But I'm going to mainly speak to you today about Brooklyn Bridge Park. In particular, my work on the Pier 5 uplands. So as many of you know, Brooklyn Bridge Park is a transformation of a vacant waterfront site on the Brooklyn waterfront into a vibrant and thriving public park, 85 acres along the East River across from Lower Manhattan. I think it's been great for me kind of stepping into a project with such a design legacy as this. I've only been at the firm for just over 2 years, and I've been fortunate enough to kind of slot in to such an awesome project. And on one hand, hear and learn from the experience of all of my now mentors about the lessons learned, things that, all the technical and amazing things that have gone into it. But in particular, I think one of the amazing things is to actually leave the office and walk down to the park and find some of these unpredicted spots that become actually very special places for people in the park. This particular image is what we call the Veil. It's largely the consequence of bringing up the earth on Pier 1, one creating a southward slope towards the harbor, and the other creating a slope towards the bridges. And the consequence is kind of this valley of land that gives you this enclosure with the trees, and it's just an incredibly powerful place to be and be kind of secluded in such a public place. Again, as I said earlier, this is an incredibly complex project where I think almost any aspects of the design could deserve almost their own session. So today I'm going to focus on kind of the sound attenuation berm and how the organizing principles of this, you know, it's it's the organizing principle, sorry, of the north-south kind of middle parts of the park, where the site is very compressed, and directly to the east is the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. So by creating this 35-foot tall earthen berm, we were able to kind of create a sound barrier to make the experience through the park much, much more experientially pleasant and just less intrusive. And you actually forget that you're next to such, can I say offensive piece of infrastructure? Ferocious. So moving to the Pier 5 uplands, the Pier 5 uplands is the southern extension of the 3-4 uplands sound berm. A 5-acre site, when we started, had a large building, 1-story building in the north, heavily dilapidated, very flat site. In the original design, original master plan, this building was to be retained as the maintenance and operations building for the park. However, by the time it came to construct this site, the building was falling apart and it was no longer feasible to keep it. So it allowed us to come in and rethink the site and capitalize on the fact that we have this more space, that the berm itself could actually come and whip back into the site and kind of both more effectively attenuate the sound by kind of creating a nook, but also experientially allowing us to engage with the landform, to create more spatial surroundings and a spatial engagement with it. We worked very closely with acoustic technicians and an understanding of how this landform can actually operate the way we wanted it to achieve these things, as well as some of the more nuanced things about alluding to
previous uses on the site, the escarpment that was removed with the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. This is the final grading plan, and going through a lot of the technical analysis to make sure that what we were designing actually was going to work. As Michael said earlier, and as the importance of model making and how that really allows us to kind of think about these spaces we wanted to create and then really get into it and get a sense of what that's going to feel like. To the bottom of the image is this MTA. It's the subway ventilation building. It's probably one of the most ugly things I've ever seen. So the notion of being able to kind of make this disappear as much as the BQE on the site was something we were really interested in. So I think some of the things you don't know, some of the things I find really interesting, I'm a total geek about all this, is all the technical and geotechnical stuff that goes into building such an intense piece of landform. These are one-to-one slopes going up 30 feet on a flat site. So all the technical engineering that goes into it, layers of geotextiles every foot of the berm, reinforced soils with geofibers, lessons that we learned kind of from the first iteration of the berm, which I didn't actually work on, so I just got to learn from the others, just about how this all comes together. And actually, I think I was saying yesterday to one of you, one of the things that I like is learning about all this technical stuff is really fun because not as a restraint, but actually understanding enough of it so that you can push it further is something I really enjoy about all this. So making it green, a challenge that was faced with the 3-4 uplands was actually getting plants to propagate on the steep one-to-one slopes and also taking care of weeds and maintenance on such steep slopes. So for this time around, we were planting a cover crop of oats. So as soon as the planting soil went in, there were plants on it to avoid other things from going out. This is the hydro seeding and the mulching of it. Great story about this was how to get seed to kind of stick to these slopes without just washing away. My coworker Nick in the office came up with a brilliant idea of something he observed in nature was how seed and plants were growing on steep slopes in the depressions made by goats and wildlife climbing these steep slopes. So him working with Laura came up with the idea of simply dimpling the soil on the berm, sprinkling seed, and then hydromulching on that, and it has worked incredibly well. The image to the right is just like 2 weeks after it was seeded. Looks good, so now what? We worked really closely with the park throughout construction and their maintenance staff to make sure that what we were building is going to be a lot easier to maintain. Through this process, we added more maintenance paths, goat paths as we lovingly call them, for maintenance. And then just a few shots of I know I kind of focused a lot on the technical stuff, but for me it's all about how that stuff can inform a design process but make something where you don't even know it's there, and it's overwhelming to be next to this landform now, and seeing it all come together is incredibly humbling for myself, and I'm just still worried that something's going to go wrong. I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? So here is, this is the recent shot. So it's just crazy to be standing up here, it's not here, at the top of this berm, and just feeling the presence and the power of this landform and what that means. And I will now hand it over to Chris. Thanks.
So this first shot, as Andy and Scott each showed a sort of garden that they did in the office with Michael, is actually the Cambridge office garden. The office is a house in a residential neighborhood of North Cambridge. And it's sort of a testing ground for materials and ideas and plants, and it's always sort of had that life in the office where, this is one of many, many iterations of what this space has been. And I would be very surprised if it stayed this way forever. But it sort of speaks to this, this idea of working through the idea of materials and gardens closely with Michael and others in the office that I certainly had a hand in, but as did many other people as we were working through some of these ideas. But this shot was taken, I think, 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning while I was out there laying out the bricks, standing on the roof with an iPhone, sort of leaning over, trying to show Michael progress on the construction. But I wanted to speak about the first park that I did with Michael, and I specifically because Scott and Andy covered these really sort of complex projects that had really complicated social issues, really complicated technical issues. This was sort of a different animal in that I had just graduated from Penn State. I'd been in the office, I think, 6 to 8 months when I started this project, and I had a sort of really pragmatic design approach coming out of just finished a BLA sort of site analysis program, like, you have these set constraints kind of thing, and it was an opportunity to really first start thinking about landscape in terms of the felt experience. It was a project that really evolved by being out on site with Michael and others in the office, where you're like, Michael like grabs you by the shoulders and says, like stand here, and like, what do you really feel right here? So I wanted to talk about this project and how it evolved, really around the sort of visceral felt aspects of a landscape. It's just about a 1.5 acre site in the Lower Alston neighborhood, there in the bottom right, a residential neighborhood. Harvard University is off to the left of the image, on the other side of the Charles River, but slowly expanding toward Alston in the Harvard expansion process. And that's Boston skyline off in the distance there. But it's also a really critical project in that it's the first piece of a much larger master plan, a 2050 master plan for, as part of that campus expansion, this greenway that at one end ends in the Charles River, and then at the other end is what we were calling Library Park at the time. So it has this sort of, it's a landscape that needs to respond to both the existing context of the neighborhood, but also the sort of, long-term vision for it being the terminus of a longer greenway that, on the other end is responding to the sort of gravity of the Charles River. It sits right behind a really beautiful library built by Machado Silvetti just a few years before we were involved in the project. This is why we always called it Library Park. It's sort of the idea was always that it was a library within a park. But in reality, it's sort of the backyard of the library, and one that is really hard to read from that, or was really hard to read as a site, just along North Harvard Street there. These two views are showing sort of either side of the library, looking down toward the interior of the site. And so the project, as I was saying, sort of really evolved in thinking about the felt experience of what the landscape was now and what it could be. And so most of the site analysis, as I said, was really going out there and sort of having these really visceral experiences of what was there and perhaps what was missing. So here's our site analysis drawing, just a site photo standing out there. This is as I've crossed now behind the library. That's the back door, sort of in the middle of the building there, and that big window is into a children's reading room and an event room where they have community meetings and things like that. But one of the first things we were tackling was the idea that, we're calling this Library Park, but there's a parking lot, right between the library and the park. So the first move was very simply to just rotate that down to the corner of the site and reestablish this connection of library and park and sort of giving it that backyard or that sort of wrapping around yard that we were looking to create. So that dashed white line you see is sort of our limit of work. The lawn around it is being developed right now. It's part of sort of phase 2 of that many-phased greenway that's long in process here. And so this is an image sort of from the same spot of reconnecting the park to the library, taken this past summer. But I think more importantly, and really what most of the studies of the park were about, were sort of dealing with the existing condition, which was this incredibly flat site and just 1.5 acres, but wanting to be so much more than that. So it was about, dealing with the flatness, but also dealing with the connection to the library, which incredibly beautiful in the front, but maybe not quite as much in the back. So we're trying to sort of envelop the library within the landscape. And so it was about creating a sense of boundlessness, tucking away the back of the library, but also making this small 1.5 acre park feel much larger than it is, by sort of, you know, creating a meandering experience through it, or eclipsing views that you don't necessarily see the whole thing in one single reading of the park. But also about creating an icon or a destination landscape, both for the neighborhood, but sort of also responding to that longer greenway experience where you've got the sort of gravity of the Charles River on one side and the need for something else to act as the terminus there of that future greenway project. So we looked at this sort of precedent or icon image of Silbury Hill in England, and the idea that it, in the same way that water pulls people toward it, this sort of desire to get up and get prospect, and just the act of climbing the hill is all part of that really, you know, sort of visceral quality of landscape. So Michael asked me to go out and see how to, you know, how high we could get up on site, you know, physically in the grading, but also what height we needed to sort of create that iconicity of a landform. And he told me to go out and hold a big red balloon while someone took pictures of me. It was a little rainy, and maybe I was a little lazy and a little too slick, as Michael reminded me. So I made these little 3D models on the computer. I don't think he was so pleased with my first experience of going out and really experiencing landscape if I was sitting there at the computer, like, doing this. But it did tell us things about, you know, how that sort of iconicity, or what sort of elevation would get that view from out on North Harvard Street from the images I showed before. Or maybe it was a series of landforms and high points that were legible from the street that, you know, created this sort of, you know, this memory of a landscape of moments or high points that were legible from the street. So this was the sort of first sketch, the idea that there were these elements within the landscape, these different rooms, some high, some low, where we developed the program and the planting to create a really intense variety within a small landscape. We started looking, in addition to the Silbury Hill example, at precedents of how to program these small circular rooms. This is the Ash Dome by David Nash. And so we went through these studies, just as Scott showed all of his iterations. Some of these plans are really kind of rough to look at, but of these sort of all these many icons or circles within the landscape of this series of rooms, it was a process of really just distilling the landscape plan down to that experience of getting up and getting out of the site that was so critical. And so going through here, the plan just continues to get simpler and simpler. That one iconic landform that you see sort of in the top middle of the image being the crux of the study, as we'll see. But it was also about thinking about that experience of climbing the hill and how this sort of really static spiral wasn't really doing it for us. So that slowly became, you know, an elongated version of itself that gave you a more dynamic reading of the landscape as you climbed up to get to a higher elevation. And then the final-ish plan before construction, it's really the simplest form of all of the studies that we had done. But it developed a series of rooms, as I was talking about, one being the event lawn in the back of the park. This is sort of the receiving end of the future greenway, if you will. A really small lawn, probably 1/4 of an acre or something like that. But it's ringed with many columnar trees to sort of play off that small scale again by, you know, planting it with a lot of little trees. It helps to make the space feel bigger and more diverse than it would with just a few larger canopy trees. A reading circle that's really just a tiny nook off the back of the library with a couple large pieces of stone for kids to sit on and sort of be within the landscape while they grabbed a good Leo Leone book. Or back there in the outdoor classroom, which is sort of the receiving end of the lawn. Again, somewhere to sit, but maybe somewhere to perform, or, you know, listen to someone read a book to a group of kids. But really, the the most critical thing that we were trying to figure out was that experience, the experience of getting up, of getting a new perspective of the landscape, of the future greenway and of the surrounding context. So most of the studies were really about figuring out, you know, the grading certainly, but also just like what that experience felt like. And it was a really sort of fundamental shift from the way that I had always been thinking of that sort of, you know, BLA landscape approach, to suddenly be thinking about materials and the act of walking and the slope that you're creating and how that sort of, you know, feels comfortably. So I, just as Scott showed all of his different iterations, I was trying to find, you know, earlier iterations of the plan and stumbled into one of my old CAD files, and there were many of these that had dozens or hundreds of attempts at trying to grade this sloping path in a landform, which was awful at times. It was the first time that I like really realized that I was way in over my head. I mean, I had no idea what I was doing in terms of grading. So I was trying to like learn about physical landscape from Michael and Emily, who was the project manager on the project, but also taking Grading 101 from Laura, which is like an AP level grading class with, I was in trouble. That was basically the lesson there. So somehow we got there. I'm not sure that I ended up drawing this final one. It may have been someone else giving a little bit of help, but and this is the built landform, sort of the centerpiece of the park that, as you can see, helps to take away that, not only take away the flatness, but take away that like singular reading of this open field, and has a sort of a gravity to it that pulls you to it, you know, whether it's climbing up the stairs, a sort of shortcut up and down, or going around that winding path that you can see sort of scooping off to the right. What I found that I didn't really expect, having been out there, something that Michael, I think, said early on, but I didn't really get, was that the stairs are really, it's the way down, but that act of walking up very slowly and the sort of view of the landscape that unfolds as you're slowly climbing the hill is really powerful, and it's what you do. It's not, like, even though the stairs are right there and it's much shorter, that act of getting up is really, really critical to the park. There were, of course, some technical issues to deal with here, as there always are. You know, here too, we had geotechnical issues where we ended up using this EPS foam to build up the grade so that the landform didn't settle and sink and turn back into a flat site. I think Emily helped to sort of shield me from the technical stuff so I could really focus on the felt experience. This is the cross section of that, showing the layers of geofoam that Andy and Scott both referenced in their two projects. But you know, all of that technical stuff was really worth it in the way that it creates this elevated perspective of landscape, this yet another sort of room within this small landscape, one that plays off the small scale and provides a sort of playful ring for kids to run around or again, grab a book and sit at the top of the hill. But still really reacts to that experience of climbing, that it plays into the scale of the park, but also provides a sort of loop within the everyday life of the people in that Lower Alston neighborhood. It's really who that landscape was for and the people who use it the most.
So we just have a 5-minute, real short conclusion, and I have one question for the group that I've been interested to ask. I have had the privileged position of being involved in the conversations of the last few days and before leading up to this session. And one of the things that I really appreciate is the honesty that we've seen in this about the actual design process, the joy in being in over our heads. And we're hearing from a firm that to many of us represents the ultimate mastery of the beauty and brains possible in landscape. And one might think, a lot of us who are familiar with the expectations of young professionals and students, one might think that MVVA would have the most well-honed, synthesized, routine mentorship program, that you come in and you're in some kind of progressive, passive learning and absorption for years before you're handed the reins. And instead, we're seeing a very mindful, purposeful throw into the fire, mentoring by making, each of the younger professionals that talked about having a moment when he realized he was in over his head. And Michael talked about how important that is, and in fact, the joy in not knowing what's going to happen when you put certain materials together or certain clients or people together. So I think it's a really great reminder for all of us. The other thing that really struck me was a lot of times as young people, we expect that our youth and lack of experience is going to be an obstacle in the firm that we're joining, that there's going to be this waiting period before we're valuable. And instead, I'm almost hearing that that lack of experience, or that what Michael calls the outsider's love of the profession, is what fuels, it's a big part of what fuels the work and their ability to have a novel approach to each project. And I was curious to ask Andy, Chris, and Scott if there was a moment when you realized, I mean, I think most of us would have been surprised to realize going to a firm like MVVA that your lack of experience was not only not holding you back, but it might even be something that's particularly valued for your novel and fresh look at what you were working on. Oh, we have a lack of mics up here, so.
Well, I think to start, what your question reminds me of is like when Andy comes into the firm and he brings this new energy and freshness and excitement about it. So we've been working on Brooklyn Bridge Park for 20 years, and we keep recreating and reinventing it, but to have someone so excited, so eager, and so energetic to come in, it's just like lightning in the office. So we really like having that energy and excitement, and it's refreshing, I think. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
Well, to build off that is, you know, it's moments of being completely over your head and just standing up straight and pretending that everything's okay and smiling and like, holy shit, like. But I think it's also, I mean, not that this is maybe something that should be celebrated, but maybe it's something interesting to think about is there's oftentimes throughout that particular project where I didn't know what I was doing and didn't even know about these previous iterations or things that happened, and then learning about them, but through that learning and questioning, pushing what was actually possible or what was figured out before in a way.
Yeah, and I also think it has a lot to do with just the hunger that comes with being like young and fresh. I knew like when I first got the job, I thought I was in over my head, to be perfectly honest. But I think, yeah, still am. But it was just about coming into an office that had so much going on that you wanted to be a part of it. And I think that as a young person, the more you sort of stuck your neck out or said something when you weren't sure if like it really was your role to say something, that the better off you were in the firm. We also, you called it throwing it into the fire. Laura has coined it, she likes to think of it as hot dip galvanizing us.
That's much better.
Experience. But
That's great. Are there any questions from the audience? We have about a minute. Yes, in the green.
It's very evident that material is really important to your work. And Michael, I'm not sure I understood what you said about the Rauschenberg quote, because I interpreted that as the work itself comes through the material. And I've been thinking about this because of the way that landscape architects and artists are educated in real difference. Like a studio art education is like throwing a kid in a room and letting him figure it out with the materials in front of him. But that's never really a part of the education of a landscape architect. But that's what you're doing when new people come into your firm, it seems. Here's the feel, here's the brick. Can you talk about that a little as an educator?
Do you want a mic?
So the question was about materials in education of landscape architects. Clearly, it's prominent in the education of landscape architects coming to MVVA.
Well, I want to answer it by going back to Shannon's very astute, and I actually So you could say that I'm a bloodsucker, and I need the energy of these young people, if you wanted to. But it's a little nicer than that. What Shannon said is incredibly true, but it relates to Cliff, right? It relates to what you're asking, which is, you know something? When you're 22 years old and you just graduated from Penn State, you actually know how you feel about schist next to endicott manganese. I may have different I may respond to it, frankly, in a more elevated way, but I'm not the audience. My elevated vantage point as the creator of the monk, I'm making the monks, when Caroline and I were in the Monk's Garden, we ran into her cousin that she hadn't seen in like 10 years, and they're like, he delivered cheese and she was a nurse. Like they're wildly wonderful people, but not aesthetes. And I just think that part of what we do in the office when we all stand, like that picture where we were all standing around, I mean, you know, Sarah's father was a theater designer, and Noonie grew up in Korea, and Liz grew up on the Upper East Side in New York, and Matt and me, I grew up on a dairy farm. You know, like we have this collective sense of response. So it's a form of you're so right to say that the beginners, what they don't have in the trilogy of brains, heart, and means, mostly they don't have means. Brains, if you interpret brains as being knowledge of the field, but they certainly have brains with respect to the role of parks in their life. Like, that's not heart. Understanding how a park works is your intelligence. Your heart is the way that you respond to it. So, I mean, I was educated like all other BLAs. Like, we never talked about materials. I mean, Laura teaches at GSD, but do you teach materials, or is there much focus? I know Neil does some of that, but it's not a big focus. If it's there at all, it's not a big focus. And in a way, it's like writers not knowing sentence structure or the meaning of word. It's like crazy, you know, it's crazy. And I love something that Shannon, we had this kind of back and forth, and she was saying, well, one of the things I like about the examples that you're showing is that I think a lot of what all of us are doing, and us too, by the way, and I think you were saying yourselves, we're getting coerced by the efficiencies of the technologies that are making our projects look the same. And that's clearly something that we're pushing back at. And by the way, we don't only work on projects with big budgets. Like Brooklyn Bridge Park does not have a big budget, you know, so, but I like your question because I think I went through a long period where I was Scott, how he felt about himself, that, oh, I want to be an artist, I don't want to be a landscape architect. And landscape architects are not really artists. I mean, we're landscape architects, that's enough, you know? And what we do is related, but, you know, and it doesn't mean that there was any disrespect about an artist, but our work doesn't hang on a wall. Our work is part of somebody's life, and that's something else.
That was the perfect singular question to get from the audience, and I think a really great note to release everyone on. Thank you for coming.